Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Well, if you're listening to this, you probably know we released our final University of Texas Politics Project poll of the 2024 election cycle last Friday. And today's podcast will be about what those results can tell us about the overall trajectory of the campaign in Texas. As we record this late Tuesday morning, early voting got underway in the state yesterday. If you're one of the people declaring historic early voting turnout, I would suggest maybe wait for the numbers, but hey, just a hunch. We are exactly 2 weeks away from Election Day, and I won't sing the Leonard Cohen song, but I will say I'm hearing Hallelujah in my head, among other things.
That's not the only thing.
As is our custom, the screaming of the lambs being one of them. Yeah. As is our custom, I'm happy to be joined today by Daron, Professor of Government here at the University of Texas at Austin, co-founder of our polling project here. Are you getting any sleep these days, Professor Shaw?
No, Big Jim. In fact, I am not.
You had that look about you.
I'm running on Jolt Cola and democracy. Our once colleague Joe Tenbar just look at me sometimes and go, "You got the look of the hunted." And he was pretty good at catching that. And of course, by Josh Blank, Research Director for the Texas Politics Project. You look reasonably well rested.
Yeah,
Even though you just walked in going, isn't it 5 o'clock already?
Well, I was thinking that. No, it's funny. And I was telling Daron, I had like a little person throw up on me last night. This is my child, but it's sort of like, I'm like, yeah, I guess so. I mean, it could be worse.
Yeah, right.
I'm not being thrown up on.
Yes, but a little puke to spice up the exhaustion. Good.
Hey, you know what they say? Love is the suspension of disgust.
There
anyway.
you well, okay.
Thanks, Matt Vandenbroek.
So have you been watching Industry? All right. Anyway, all right. So let's look at the polling, and before we spiral off too far, and let's start with the presidential race. Josh, as is custom, why don't you give us the bullet on the top lines and maybe what we see in the party ID tabs too, if you got that handy.
Yeah, sure. So overall, now I should say real quick, we did jump to a likely voter screen. We've been talking about this a lot throughout the election cycle. We've been relying on registered voters, and we could, talk about why that's the case. Ultimately, as we were kind of commenting amongst ourselves before this podcast, asking an attitudinal question about the likelihood to vote to people in February, let's say, of an election year can be a little bit...
Even August, really.
It can be, I think it can be a little bit silly. And historically, we have not done likely voter screens until the October poll, which is what we did here. So two things. So one, we're looking at likely voters, which in this case means people who tell us that they vote in every or almost every election. So the people who historically vote regularly, big predictor of voting, or those people who say on a 10-point scale, rating their own likelihood to vote, that they are a 9 or 10 absolutely certain to vote kind of voter. And that way we get the people who maybe don't have as consistent of a voting history, but express that they are definitely voting in this election.
And we should flag that we know there are lots of different ways to do this. There's this is a combination of, technique, style.
Yeah, I would say honestly, not to, promote myself here, but if you search my name and likely voter in Texas, you can find a lot of writing and interviews and stuff on this topic and how we can think about it and talk about it. And there's other stuff out there too. But if you're interested in the Texas context, that would be what I'd look at. Okay, so as I said, we're looking at likely voters here overall. Oh, and there's a force also. That's the other thing about this. So because we are going to have voters in the voting booth now, if someone says to us on our first trial ballot question, maybe they're not sure how they're going to vote yet. Well, if you say you're a likely voter and you're going to show up, we want to simulate being in the voting booth. So then we say, no, but really, who are you going to vote for from the named candidates in this race, right? And then we combine the results of the people who told us initially who they'd vote for with the votes of those people who basically are their second, the choices of the
which
people
we'll
who are
inevitably
forced.
refer to as the force.
The force, exactly.
Not to be confused with, the force.
Not that force. Okay. So overall, with all those caveats aside,
I knew a Star Wars joke would make Darren smile a little.
Yeah,
A
that's
reference
cute.
would make Darren smile a little. I'm
Any
trying
reference to life as we used to know it.
I'm trying to cheer you up here a little.
it's not working. Okay. So anyway, to move on then, top of the ticket, we see Trump leading Harris 51-46, so a 5-point advantage, and Trump is over that magical 50% number. We're seeing overwhelming partisan support. So among Republicans, 95% say they will be voting. 95% of Republican likely voters say they'll be voting for Trump. 96% of likely Democratic voters say they'll be voting for Harris. Key group here, independents, breaks slightly for Harris, 44-35. We could jump into some other subgroups here, but I think that's about how deep we want to start, right?
So at that, Darren, first cut, what do you make of this? And, where do you put this in the arc of the race, the arc of Texas,
Right. I think it's as we've all talked about, it's a continuation of a long, kind of slow movement or erosion, I guess, of the Republican dominance in the state. It's not going to make people who want to turn Texas blue immediately very happy, and it probably won't make MAGA-inclined folks very happy either. And I think it's interesting because Trump has so dominated political culture and the environment of the last 8 years that sometimes it's difficult to keep your eye on these long trending secular tendencies that we have in the state and kind of parse out what's kind of real, what's on the what's on the trend line versus what's anomalous. And I think our poll has been pretty consistent over the course of this cycle. We don't see Trump in a lot of trouble here. On the other hand, Trump is not getting what native son George W. Bush got or dominant Republican candidates in the past.
Or even Mitt Romney.
Yeah, yeah.
Just,
I've made the case for a while back, and I think you guys agree that Trump's not a particularly good fit for Texas. The sort of style and appeal that he has, it has some resonance with the Republicans here, but not as much as it does, say, in the upper Midwest, where people who previously not been Republican are now Republican, or at least voting such. In Texas, he's just sort of in some ways, a mediocre Republican presidential candidate. And I think that's what you see in the data. On the other hand, as Josh mentioned, there's basically zero defection. And with zero partisan defection, Democrats don't win in Texas. And so that's the fundamental problem for Harris. We talked a while back about, and we can talk about this in the context of the Senate races that are out there. If you're a Democrat and you're really looking to be aggressive, would you make a play here? And I think the answer is no. And in the context of the Senate race, which we'll get to, I think the data I've seen coming out of Florida and maybe even Nebraska suggest that if I'm at the DSCC, thinking about where I want to spend party money, I think Texas would probably be number 3 on my list of opportunities right now. Even though I understand the Nebraska candidate is technically not a Democrat, but the Nebraska.
Well, you got to take what you can get.
Yeah, exactly.
Josh, you were talking about subgroups. What are you noticing here? I mean, and maybe move us into that a little bit, because I am curious what Darren thinks about some of these subgroup totals. Not only what we're seeing, but the caveats around them.
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously there's some groups in the electorate we're really interested in. I mean, I think, we've talked kind of at length about how a lot has been made in this election cycle about, the preferences of African-American voters. And, by all accounts, I think in this poll, based on what I've seen in previous October polls, I don't really see a lot of defection here. I mean, we're seeing 85% of African-American voters, or 84% saying they're going to vote for Harris, 15% for Trump. We'll see if that really manifests, or whether that gets a little bit wider. But I also kind of feel like that seems pretty consistent with what we've seen in the past. Young people have come back to Harris, 58-38 for the, under 29 group. I think, just to be honest about the mechanics here, I think the June poll, we got a little bit of an outlier with that young sample in there. Maybe not. It's a large margin of error. Small sample size.
It's
going to bounce
small
around.
Number in that cell.
Under 30 is roughly 15-16% of the Texas electorate, right? So if we're doing a 1,200 person sample, right? You're talking about, upwards of 100. So we report those numbers. We report basically all of them, but we emphasize, it's a little rule of thumb. You got to be in triple digits in terms of interviews before Josh or Jim or I will say anything really meaningful about it.
Commit.
So, right, exactly. So,
Right.
But even such, we were over 100 with the June poll with younger voters, but not by much. And so you got not only a low sample size issue, but you have that segment of the electorate is the most volatile.
Yeah, and that's also, and this is something I've sort of, been talking to people a lot here, but, I think it's really, it seems to me in some ways, I was thinking about this, talking about Trump's effect on politics, and this might get a little bit askew from this result, but it's sort of an interesting thing to me is just, in some ways there's sort of been I think an engagement polarization also, right? Where you've got people who are engaged in politics getting hyper engaged. And when you think about, again, a lot of calls today about turnout in the early voting, I think for some people in Texas and elsewhere, people who watch cable news all the time, the people who've just been following this race, as close as maybe we are, they're ready to vote. They're ready to vote for tomorrow, right? They're ready to vote immediately. And I think you're seeing that. And there's a lot of people who are just turned off by this, right? And I think that matters for us. And I think this is kind of why we want to be careful, especially in the summer and the spring before the election, to sort of not draw these really broad conclusions. Because I think a lot of people sort of look at, politics because they tell us and they're disgusted by it and they don't want to really get involved in it. But all of a sudden now you start talking about, we're in the fall, you're watching your college football, you're watching the Dallas Cowboys, and you know what you're seeing? You're seeing Colin Allred ads and you're seeing Ted Cruz ads. And now that $80 million that everybody's pouring in, the extra, 5 or 10 that the Democrats are going to pour in, it's all being spent right now, right? And they're all being contacted right now. And so it's not surprising to see, again, in this last poll, I think people sort of falling back into the patterns we kind of expect. And the difficult part in Texas in some ways is that the places where it's competitive, it's super competitive. The suburbs still look super competitive. And, so ultimately we see I think within the margin is basically just kind of a toss-up in those areas. We'll see if that's how it shakes out. Yeah. I don't think it's going to shake out that way. Personally.
Our suburban numbers, which is to this subsample size, and this sample is about half the sample.
Yeah.
Trump plus 5, 51, 46.
Which is the top of the ticket number.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
A couple small things on the subgroups. The first is really stunning numbers amongst Latinos. Mm-hmm. We actually have Trump with a very slight lead amongst Latinos. That is such a sea change. From where we were 15 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I think it's again, this sort of complication. People who think demography is destiny and who have been predicting that Texas is going to move, in a leftward direction simply as a function of, migration and birth rates and particularly Latino mobilization. Well, guess what? Politics intervenes. We collectively, and I feel safe speaking for my colleagues here, politics are not static.
Yeah.
And so what you're seeing in Texas is, there is what's kind of striking in a lot of ways is the continued slow erosion of the Republican dominance. At the same time, a key element of the Democratic coalition is basically kind of moved to almost 50-50 at this point.
At least in this cycle.
At least this cycle.
At least in this cycle under these conditions. And I think that's also your point about the static. It's not being static is the fact that, again, as voters have tuned in, and I think we've polled, throughout this election cycle, the main issue that they're looking at are economic issues and the border, right? And in Texas, that gives a clear advantage, to Trump, gives a clear advantage to Republicans. And I think that's accruing to among Hispanic voters in a way that, we'll see, I think, what happens, in a couple election cycles. I'm curious to see what, whether this is representing a new norm, which I kind of doubt, or whether this is, again, I think I do love that point. I want to sit on it because I think it is really interesting. As the state is becoming more and more competitive, I think this is something that's hard for people to understand kind of outside of Texas, that as the state is becoming more competitive, it doesn't mean that Democrats are necessarily running away with these constituencies. Yeah. They're not necessarily, it's not as though it's because 75% of Hispanics are voting for Democrats. If anything, what you're seeing now is this is where the competition is taking place in the suburbs with this group of voters, with younger voters, honestly, because the state is changing, but it's not, these people enter the electorate and all of a sudden, well, now it's a blue Texas, right?
Yeah, there's a book written, I believe it's published in 2004, it might be 2006, by Judas and Teixeira, John Judas and Roy Teixeira, about the emerging Democratic majority. And it's a play on the old Kevin Phillips book in the 60s, the emerging Republican majority. And I think if you would submit these cross tabs from our poll to those scholars, they would be stunned that their thesis is not necessarily wrong, that, you know, the kind of demography of the country is changing in a way that will help the Democrats. But the assumptions they had about Democratic dominance amongst young people, Democratic dominance amongst Latinos, and to a broader extent racial and ethnic minorities, that's actually diminished, and it's diminished considerably, but it's been offset by compensatory movement amongst these traditional constituencies, people with a college education, et cetera. The suburban point in Texas is really interesting to me because in other parts of the country, and actually in some parts of Texas, you get what I would refer to as the northern Virginiazation of the suburbs. That is people fleeing the urban core to find affordable housing and better schools. And the notion that, and by the way, this is not to excuse Republican messaging and Republican policies, but the notion that Republicans have simply alienated these voters in the suburbs as if they've simply turned off all these suburban voters who are the same voters year after year is nonsense. The main change in the suburbs is migration.
Yeah, it's the composition of
it's
the
the
suburbs.
composition,
The suburbs do not look
yeah.
like what
Right.
they did.
And again, it's not to say that Republican messaging on abortion hasn't turned off suburban women. It's to say that the notion that it's been persuasion that's going on in the suburbs, that's what's kind of made them more competitive, is not correct. It's, the northern Virginiazation, I think you see it most obviously in Texas, in Travis, right, where Williamson and Hayes.
Collin, honestly, in Dallas.
Yeah, in Dallas. Used to be these bedrock Republican conservative areas, and they're not anymore. But it's not because those voters have suddenly become, turned off from the it's that those voters aren't the same voters anymore.
Well, and a lot of the voters who've moved into those areas would have moved to D.C. or to Austin or to Dallas, but they can't afford to.
Yeah.
They're not trying to get out of there. They are moving to what is being offered.
Right,
there.
and they bring their politics with them.
And the flip side of that's interesting that I've been kind of noticing in some of our internals lately is that Democrats are hitting something of a ceiling in the urban areas.
It seems that way.
And I wouldn't bet my life on that right now, but it kind of feels that way to me as I look at these numbers. A few times recently, looking at our numbers, looking at other numbers, I've thought, shouldn't that urban number for Democrats be a little higher? Yeah. But then when you look more closely and look back, well, maybe not. Right.
Yeah, and I think this also speaks to some of the the difficulties of math, right? And I was talking with somebody about this recently. Say, if let's say for example, there's an extra 200,000 voters have registered, let's say in Dallas County or whatever. I'm just making numbers up right now to be clear, right? And you say, well, okay, how Democratic do you think Dallas County is? And let's say you think it's a 60% Democratic county. Well, then they accrue about 20,000 votes out of that. And that's the whole thing. People say, well, all these people are moving to Texas from these other states. Like, yeah, but okay, so if if 60% of them are Democrat, which is not what I see in the data anyway, that's a separate question. Then you say, okay, so if every 10 people come in, Democrats might get one more vote if they all vote. And that's the thing about demographic change is that in addition to it being slow, part of the reasons it's slow is because no group is entering as 100% Democrat or 100% Republican. People are coming to the suburbs, and even those people who are coming to the suburbs are not necessarily, and even if they're coming because they're young and they want all the things that the cities have to offer and urbanism and jobs and all that, it's still not 100% Democrats.
Yeah.
You're still only accruing a few Democratic votes out of every one of these people, and that's why this is so slow.
One of the things we've seen, we've been asking a question in the Texas poll over the years about whether you were born in Texas or whether you moved here from somewhere else. And we've now got something like 35,000, 36,000 total cases, about 10,000 of which are transplants, right? And the 10,000 allows us, and we ask a secondary question, well, where'd you come from? Mm-hmm. And, a chunk come from California. That's the standard story that, everybody wants to write about. But a bunch come from Louisiana and Florida after hurricanes. A bunch come from the upper Midwest
Oklahoma.
For retirements. Yeah. And what we found is that where they come from and the reason that they come greatly affects where they end up. And it's influenced by, or the reasons that they come are very different. And they're not unipolar in terms of the Democratic versus Republican. They're kind of mixed.
Well, and to add to that, you look at the growth of the cities and the counties sort of surrounding the major cities in Texas, and you look for what is the source of this population growth. The majority of that population growth is people moving within Texas. And if they're moving from somewhere that's not another major city, they're moving from actually a pretty conservative political climate into the cities. And that's something else that I think people sort of fail to recognize, because everybody wants to say, oh, it's everybody from California. They're all liberal. And you look at the polling and say, well, first of all, they're not all liberal.
Right.
No chance of that. But also it's actually a small share. And really most of this is about Texans moving around Texas. And, when you think about that, you say, oh, you mean that state that continues to vote Republican? And you say, yeah, that's right.
Right. And I think, the interesting kind of takeaway and something as I'm kind of processing this conversation is also, and going back to Latinos for just a beat, is the conventional conversations tend to not account for shifts within these groups and the compositional, and I think that's a big, the Latino discussion intersects with all of this. Now, I'll be interested to see what these final numbers kind of shake out as, but I mean, some of it is the baseline assumptions are just wrong, right?
Yeah.
And in all of this, and I was expressing one of mine that, because you see what's going on in the urban areas, in your head, you tend to carry around a number of a vote share for Democrats that's probably higher than it usually is, right? And the same thing with Latinos. You think about, we've had this conversation here a bunch of times, but it's just worth adding, I think, which is, you kind of think, well, Latinos, Democratic allied group. Well, Republicans have been winning 40% of Latinos in Texas, if not routinely, certainly frequently.
Well, it's like
in statewide races.
If you were to say like, hey, I want to give you, like just a little thumbnail sketch of two voters, right? And one lives on the outskirts of Laredo in a blue collar job with no college degree, and one lives, let's say, let's just say just outside of one of the major metros, has a college degree, 25. Where do you think they're going to vote? And just knowing that, you people probably say, yeah, probably Republican, probably Democrat. Say, okay, they're Latino now. Now what?
Yeah.
I don't think that changes anything.
It
doesn't really change the context of that. And I think that's one of those things where, in some ways, it's not like it's not important, but the Hispanic and Latino identity is being sort of put on a group of people who live, very different lives in very different parts of the state, for whom that identity may not be driving their politics.
And I will die on the hill and say that says part of the reason we've been slow to recognize that about Latinos is because people were reluctant to talk about Latinos going through an immigrant assimilation process.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It sounded like, you ought to go back to the 50s and, get back in your Packard and, live your Don Draper life if you said that. But I mean, as the evidence mounts, I mean, I think we're seeing a lot of people revisiting that. Let's talk about the Senate race. Yeah. Josh, give us the bullet on the Senate race.
Yeah, so here we saw a slightly wider gap. We saw Cruz at the same 51%, but we saw Allred at 44% compared to Harris's 46%. So Cruz with a 7-point lead as opposed to Trump with 5. Should point out, all very much within the margin of error. I mean, a lot of people have asked me in a couple of days about, the nature of these gaps, and I think there's some explanations here, but I'd also say, in a technical sense, they're basically the same estimate. But that's top of the ticket. I mean, I think what the main sort of underlying piece that you want to just highlight here is the fact that, to the extent that Allred, the explanation for maybe why Allred is trailing Harris, which you'd say, well, he's less well known than Harris. There's still about 1 in 5 registered Democrats who fail to sort of register an opinion about him at this point. And that just goes with the fact that, he's not the presidential candidate. He hasn't run statewide, and he's still got some work to do, but not a lot.
Yeah. And this campaign, we've said in here before, this campaign was very quiet for a long time. I mean, I think our line, all of us, when we got together for the June and even the August poll, we kind of said, just not this race has been kind of swamped by other stuff and by the fact that neither campaign was really going out of their way to be loud in the early stages. I mean, the Cruz campaign didn't spend big to define Allred, real early. They are now, but they didn't early. And Allred didn't bolt out of the gate, to try to overcome that. And that's really clear if you go to our site, texaspolitics.utexas.edu, we have nice trend graphics on the fave, unfave for Allred that really illustrate this clearly, just how long the share of a plurality or majority didn't have a view of Allred, and for a long time it was pretty persistent even among Democrats.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, look, the race in Texas is very comparable to other sort of competitive Senate races across the country, except the parties are flipped. In most instances of these races that we're watching, whether it's Casey and McCormick, whether it's Kari Lake and Gallegos, whether it's Jackie Rose and Sam Brown in Nevada, what you've got is the Democratic incumbent polling about what Harris is polling. and the Republican underachieving Trump by 3 or 4 points. And the betting money is that by Election Day, the Republican Senate candidate's vote will basically be what Trump's vote is. In other words, there's not going to be a lot of ticket splitting. What you're seeing right now is not a function of, well, I like Trump, but I really don't like, Sam Brown or McCormick in Pennsylvania. It's that they're just not as well known. And as the election comes by, that you'll think, oh, that's the Republican Senate candidate. You'll end up with very little ticket splitting. And I think that's probably, again, flipping the parties, what you see here, which is Cruz's number is the same as Trump's number. Allred lags, Harris by a couple of points. Allred has made up most of the gap based on recognizability and Cruz's, incumbency advantage. I figure by Election Day, I'd be surprised. Now, it's only a 2-point gap where Trump's up 5 and Cruz is up 7, but I don't think there's going to be much daylight between the Cruz vote and the Trump vote or the Allred Harris vote, right? So, even though it's a little bit, I don't want to overcook the extent to which Cruz is running a little stronger than Trump right now. I think these are basically, it's the same race. I mean, the couple small things, the gender gap is kind of interesting. So on the presidential side, you've got Trump up 16 with men and Harris up 6 with women. So if you take the margins, it's a 22-point gap. That's a massive gender gap, by the way, historically. On the Senate side, Cruz up 17 amongst men, Allred up 2. Now, the Cruz number is basically the same as the Trump number, right? Trump's up 16 with men, Cruz is up 17, right? Allred's running a little weaker with women. Harris is up 6, Allred is up 2. Is there an argument that that's basically the electing the first female president bump, or is it a function of Allred's not quite as well known amongst women?
Yeah, I mean, I think that 3% drop among women, deficit among, in the difference between the Allred and the Harris here could probably be pretty easily mapped onto the no opinions, don't knows. Neutrals.
I think that's real. So that's
suspect.
That's what I'm struggling with. Struggling is a strong word, I guess, at this point. But well, I guess to the extent Allred underachieves Harris, do we think that's a real thing, or do we think, basically based on, there's some number of women who are, say like, I would like to elect a female candidate. The Senate doesn't offer that opportunity, or is it just a matter of, women not being quite as knowledgeable about Allred in the Senate race? And
I should say, just not to be this guy, but like we are trying to divide up, what accounts for, a 3-point difference or a 2-point, right? And this is exactly, and look, this is where we are right now. I mean, this is the nature of close elections.
What else are we going to do?
What else are we going to do? But this is what it comes down to is I think, someone asked me today on a call, what's driving you crazy at this point, which was cute. It was at the end of a long call. With a reporter.
Besides you?
No, he's great. It was a great call, But I do think there is this sort of thing, we're at this point now where because the elections are so close and because we are focused on these groups in the electorate and because these groups in the electorate are only going to represent so many cases in any given poll, we get in the situation where we're having these conversations about what is the relative weight of Allred's unknown versus Trump's potential, let's say, problems with women to account for the 3-point difference. And it's like, we don't know.
You're being asked to parse the numbers.
But let me say yes and no. There's going to be over 10 million voters in Texas. So we're talking about 200,000 to 300,000 voters, right? So yes, there's a wide air band around that. But I don't know. I found the gender gap kind of interesting, possibly interesting. But I found the age gap, which speaks to this point about, look, younger voters really come to the table with less information, less history, less knowledge. And Harris is up 20 points with those under 30. Allred's up 7.
Yeah.
Now, I think that is both a function of lack of engagement, but also real in the sense that I'm not sure Allred is going to make up that. I'm not sure Allred is going to get known enough amongst those younger voters to really close that gap appreciably, right? So it's a way of conceding. I agree with the point both of you are making. But I think with certain groups, there's a real possibility it's just it's a feature, not a bug.
Well, and to my point, I'm going to say is I don't disagree with you that there's not an answer, right? And that we might not be able to figure out what the answer is once we actually have some real voting. I'm saying with the tools at our disposal, I resist the temptation to make too strong a statement about whether,
Did you ever
Trump
resist the temptation to make too strong a statement?
Well, you're getting an example now.
I'll say not without a caveat beforehand, usually.
That doesn't sound quite as good. So how about what is the narrative of this race a little bit? I mean, I think we've kind of gotten at this of the Senate race. I mean, because there's so many interesting things here that, and both races are both campaigns are trying to create the narratives here. But I mean, when you step back, I mean, we were saying, I think on the podcast a couple weeks when you weren't here, Daron, that there's an interesting, watching Ted Cruz try to run more towards the middle is fascinating to me. And I don't, and I don't mean that in like a passive aggressive way. I mean, it's just, and it's clearly a campaign tactic. I mean, because, they've been encouraging the Ted Cruz worked with Democrats stories for a year and a half. If you go back and look at when those stories first started appearing,
right.
It was, the summer of 2023. So this is not an accident. And clearly, we were treated in the Cruz all-red debate to Cruz name-dropping Democrats that he's been working with. And again, on the surface of it, it's kind of obvious, but I've been wanting to ask you what you make of that. I mean, from a campaign perspective, really, in part.
Well, we have 2 data points now from which to, pontificate. 2018, you could argue, was an outlier, the Cruz-Beto O'Rourke race, in the sense that it was a good Democratic year. Cruz was coming off having, been defeated for the Republican presidential nomination. And,
his overall numbers hurt by that.
Exactly.
You look at our job approval and favorability ratings. I mean,
so
you can see when that happened.
It looked like...
And it wasn't Democrats.
Right. It looked like, this is just a terrible kind of political environment for Cruz to run in, and he wins by a couple of points. So you figure, that's a low water mark. He'll rebound and win easily. And then you run into 2024, which is, he doesn't really have a lot of headwinds. This is not a great Democratic year. Mm-hmm. You look outside of Texas, and I understand Democrats are defending more seats, but there's really very little in play. Allred, I think, is a very strong candidate, but there's a chicken and egg thing going on here, which is Cruz weak and therefore attracts better challengers and lots of money? Or is it that better challengers want to run against Cruz and a lot of people outside of Texas as well as inside Texas want to beat Cruz? But it's not even close. There's no Republican statewide who's had to run anywhere near as hard as Ted Cruz has historically, right? So I find it interesting in that regard that I think Cruz tells us something about Texas, but I'm not sure exactly what that is.
That's why I was asking, because I'm kind of in the same, I'm kind of mulling that same.
Yeah, is it just a Cruz thing? Because we've seen, Jim and Josh and I have seen these numbers for years, which is Cruz's standing with Republicans is so strong.
It's fine.
Yeah. Compared to John Cornyn, even compared to Greg Abbott.
Compared to Donald Trump. I mean, he's up there. It's not.
Yeah, he's in that tier with Trump and Abbott.
Yep.
Right. And
among Republicans.
Yeah. And yet, he just doesn't seem to do well with independents. He seems to have these image issues and these small, sort of small bore, not inconsequential, but small bore mistakes, like during the grid, leaving the state and stuff like that. And it all adds up to, man, for a guy who is so well known and raises money and is a serious campaigner, he doesn't, he's not a lazy campaigner. Boy, he seems to be running close elections in a state where Republicans don't tend to have to face close elections. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's a marker for the Democrats, I think. It's like, boy, look, it does make me wonder, because Cruz hustles and raises money and works.
Podcasts.
And
we all know that's a lot of work.
Exactly. And as Jim mentioned, is not dumb strategically. Right. We've played this game before. Name the position Ted has taken that's really kind of out of step with the Texas electorate. We could talk a little bit about abortion, but, I don't know that Cruz has been.
Well, and then, they're not talking about that.
Yeah. Right. Exactly.
To the extent they can avoid it.
So I find this case really, really curious, right? On the one hand, you'd say, like, boy, it's a low watermark. Well, it would be the real question would be, what if Ted were lazy and didn't hustle and didn't raise money? Could the Democrats win that seat? I'm inclined to think they probably could.
Depends on the cycle.
Yeah, I
It would
think
depend
that's
on the
right.
cycle.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, and I think just to follow that up, I guess, then I think you're kind of throwing it around.
Yeah.
I think the thing that sort of strikes me, about this cycle, two things. One of the great things about being in the position that we're in and being able to poll so regularly, and just having been here as long as we have, is we can look back and say, hey, how does that historic O'Rourke candidacy compare? And ultimately, when we look at the public opinion data, Allred has done about as well as O'Rourke. He didn't hit the same name ID as early as O'Rourke did, because O'Rourke really did do some earned media thing that just sort of gave him a national platform that's just not usual, right? But honestly, even if you consider that fact, it's almost more amazing that Allred has basically ended up, kind of in the same spot. When we look at the subgroups, when we look at the voters, he's doing fine, and with a completely different strategy. And that's the other thing too. O'Rourke made a really big, play about going to all 254 counties. He's engaging Republicans and all this. And, I don't think that's been Allred's strategy at all. It seems to really have been to focus on where the Democratic voters are and to work on turnout. And I think that's why he ran in a lot of ways.
But also to commit to a much more, I think, clearly defined ideological placement than O'Rourke ever did.
It's hard not to look at Allred's strategy as a reaction to perceived failings in O'Rourke's, at least from where I'm sitting, right?
Yeah.
We talked a lot in this podcast about, I think, one of O'Rourke's big failures being not taking a position in the immigration debate in any way, shape, or form, and Allred was not going to let that happen. In this race,
Right.
that was clear.
Yeah, his introductory ad was him on the border.
So what's interesting is, ultimately, end of the day, if this is around where the race ends, it could tighten a little. I think it's more likely to tighten a little than expand at this point, just based on some of the internal stuff. But, let's just say we're sitting here and Cruz won last time by a little under 3. Maybe he wins this time by 5 to 7. And what's interesting is you have two candidates, very different profiles, different approaches, more or less a similar outcome, right? But the one thing I will note is on the long trajectory of all this, man, the period in which Republicans had about a 10 to 15 point gap went by like that, right? We were very comfortably with Greg Abbott winning by 20 points, expecting about a 15-point margin at the top, no problem. And it kind of seems, we'll have to wait and see what the next cycle is like and whether it's a Democratic or Republican year and all these other factors, who's on the ticket, et cetera, et cetera. But it just seems like this range, this sort of, 5 to 10 point range now, it's like, well, this seems to be where maybe we are now.
You were saying this, we were having a conversation, you said that yesterday, and I was kind of mulling it, and now that you're saying it again, I would add to that period may have lasted a little longer than it feels like to you, in part because the Perry election where there were there were 4 candidates the year that both Rylander or Strayhorn
Kinky and
Kinky were on the ballot, puts an interesting little.
But wouldn't that make
dent
the period shorter of that window? If you sort of set that aside.
I would make it a little bit longer.
Okay.
Because had Perry run uncontested or without the extra candidates, he'd have won probably by double figures.
Well, that's what I mean. So then the period of the 10 to 15 point is actually shorter if you sort of say the Perry is probably actually a wider gap when you add up those other candidates.
Right, well, there's an irony here, and I think we mentioned it last time, and that is there are Republicans who, in Texas, who are, let's say, ambivalent about Trump winning in this cycle, who think that 2026, if Trump is president and Trump is defending a record and an economy, and you get the typical midterm, loss.
Well, like 2018.
Yeah. that the Republican majority in the state legislature, the House in particular, could be in trouble.
A little harder to defend.
Harder to defend. And, I've gone through some of the numbers, and there's about 10 or 11 seats that could conceivably be competitive that probably wouldn't be if Harris were to win.
Yeah.
And it's, Republicans doing the gaining in the
because within that pool of seats you're probably looking at in this election, only a few are actually competitive, even though you can say on paper that gap puts them in a bracket.
Right. That's exactly what I'm thinking, Jim.
Yeah, you also get, by that election, the maps will be a little older. All this movement that we're talking about all the time that erodes them, changes the terrain of the maps. Yep. Just to finish up that conversation about the Senate for a beat, one of the things, and I just jumped in there with that 2018. I guess what's interesting to me is kind of an abstract point, and I don't know that we'll see if it matters when we see what the numbers are, is just how much
this Senate race, in terms of both Allred and Cruz's strategy, is built on analysis of 2018, that probably, and I think I understand the human reasons for this, particularly in the Cruz campaign, is really based on 2018, but kind of underestimates just how structurally overdetermined some aspects of that race were.
Well,
in other words, 2018, people want to go like, I don't think O'Rourke is the main comparison point. I think the main comparison point is what the turnout patterns that year were, where we saw a big surge in Democratic enthusiasm, a point we've made in here, both of you make all the time, that the Donald Trump is a turnout machine kind of point that's not quite as operative in this election cycle as you guys were both really laying out well, right? Yeah. I mean, the context of 2018 of this election looks pretty different than 2024. Some of the fundamentals.
Yeah, and something I just keep repeating to people, and it's sort of like again to the point of the comparison is everyone says, well, 215,000 votes. That's awful close to zero in terms of Cruz's advantage. It's like, yeah, but you know what is even further away from that? About the 800,000 plus votes that Abbott won by, right? And the million votes, they came back and won by in another election. I mean, so it's like there's a lot more Republican votes out there, and we know they exist. Like that's the thing, they existed in the same election cycle. So, that's why I think this idea just sort of to look at everything from the lens of 2018 and sort of how close Cruz was to losing. In a lot of ways, there's other points of data, there's other information out there that might make you contextualize that.
I'll make the point I've made repeatedly, including in a book I wrote with John Petrosic, and that is there's this odd conventional wisdom amongst the cognoscenti that, boy, if everybody voted in Texas, the Democrats would really be competitive. I just see no evidence for that whatsoever. The defining characteristic of non-voters is they're less interested, less engaged, less involved. To the extent that they're going to be mobilized, the issues that would mobilize them are going to be determinative, right? So
that is perfect, is what I wanted to go to before we go to our lightning round dealer's choice, is the issue items and the issue advantages. When the three of us get together, we have to talk a little bit about issue ownership just to maintain our dork badges. But I did think those numbers were kind of interesting in terms of, where the advantages and where the disadvantages are when we look at trust in issues. And in particular, we've been talking for the last year and a half over every poll we've done about, the importance of the economy.
Right.
And the centrality of the economy and prices. And we've unpacked a lot why, there's a lag when there's an inflationary period and, prices don't go back down and people are still mad for a while or noticing for a while. But I'm wondering if there was anything you guys really noticed in that. I mean, what I noticed were the obvious things, which I think the economic gap in trust between Trump and Harris closed a little bit.
Very little.
But just a tiny bit, not enough to bank a lot of. But that's something we've also been seeing in some of the national numbers, I think, in some places. But also the persistence of the huge gap on abortion, even though that seems to not be catalyzing the race as much as Democrats want.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the persistence of the gap in trust on immigration and border security.
Right.
Is there anything hidden in there? I mean,
is anything hidden in there? That's an interesting way to put that. It's not something hidden. I mean, Daron might have a different response. I mean, I think, what I would say, the thing that's interesting, it's not hidden in there because it's something we've talked about before. And so it's sort of hiding in plain sight, but it just speaks to the advantage that Republicans, I mean, they in a lot of ways always have, an advantage, which is they have a much more focused electorate. And what I mean by that is when we ask Republicans, what are the issues they care about, more Republicans are likely to cite the same limited set of issues than we ever see amongst Democrats. And that is, both, I think, a messaging problem for Democrats, but it's also a mobilization problem. I mean, it doesn't mean that, look, I think the result that, over the entire year plus of election polling that we've been doing on this cycle, I think the trust number on abortion in Texas is one of the most striking things. Again, to see a majority of Texas voters saying, no, the Democrat.
Yeah.
It's shocking. I mean, it really stands out separate from everything. Then again, and in a poll in which the majority of those same voters said, no, we want the Republican candidate. So it's not, like there's a problem here internally, but the problem really comes down to it. But like, is that the number one issue for voters? Well, no. Is it the number one issue for Democrats? Not really. No, it's one of among a bunch of issues.
And the economic, the economic
The economic ones are still
in terms of
front and center.
what they say is important in their vote. The economic issues are still bigger than abortion.
Exactly.
And that's that's a real problem if you're a Democratic candidate.
Well, just to say the same thing a slightly different way, Harris has closed the gap on some of these critical issues, and I think
you guys are seeing that nationally.
Yeah,
right?
we are seeing it nationally, and it's something that I think it was evident in her messaging. Bruce Mehlman, who's a Democratic consultant, had a very nice comparison point of the Biden campaign versus the Harris campaign, and one of the points Mehlman made was that Biden was talking about threat to democracy, stability, stay the course, accomplishments, and Harris is talking about possibilities and change and the middle class. When she says ad nauseum, I'm a middle class girl or woman, which, by the way, I find ironic given that both of her parents have PhDs, but okay.
Well, that's a whole that's another conversation for another day.
She also grew up at an earlier time.
Yeah. Be that as it may, and whether or not she worked at McDonald's or not, that's brilliant messaging. It's and going at Trump's going to raise taxes on your taxes, and he's going to cut taxes on millionaires and billionaires. We see these in the data. The Republican advantage, you asked about lurking things. The Republican advantage on taxes in Texas is 7 points.
Yeah, that's crazy.
48 Trump, 41
crazy
Harris.
town.
Yeah,
that is crazy.
That's a stunning number to me. And overall, look, Trump's preferred or the handling advantage is about 11 points on the economy, which is basically kind of all you need to know about this race in some ways. It's the number one issue, and he's got a fairly significant point. But nationally, she really has shrunk his advantages on the economy. And nationally, she's actually shrunk his advantages on border security and immigration. That's not really what you see in Texas, a little bit.
Yeah.
But that's made her competitive because she owns a bunch of small bore issues, healthcare, climate change, abortion, these issues that people don't say are number one. But if you put 5, 6, 7, 8 of them end to end, you get enough Democrats to make you competitive.
You know what that makes me think about something, and maybe this is right or not, but kind of in terms of the lurking and what lurks in those issues, and the taxes one really makes me think this, is it makes me think about, in terms of what sort of, changes in continuity and what kind of change maybe we're seeing in the nature of the Texas electorate is, how solid is the Democratic base, right? Like, where do they start the election in terms of the share of the vote that they can expect? And when you start to see, an issue like that, generally like taxes, I think in particular is a really great example where you say like, man, that is an issue that, when you think like, this is an issue that Republicans generally, if you want your taxes lowered, you should probably ask the Republicans to do that, right? Historically. But the fact that that's a 7-point gap and that's the wider gap we're seeing at the top of the ticket, to me in some ways says, okay, wait a minute. Is it just that the Democrats have things going their way and that's how they're getting from this kind of, high 30s, maybe low 40s, maybe. What is the floor now? And I look at that, I think the floor is maybe a little bit more solid underneath Democratic candidates than maybe we've seen. Now we'll have to see. We'll do this again.
And I think there's explaining that, I think, once we actually see the votes is going to be very interesting because I can hypothesize a bunch of things. But sometimes, I think some of the things that people don't like about Donald Trump or there's a lot of things that people don't like about Donald Trump. But one of the things, I think from a Republican perspective that might make people crazy is like, the way, Trump's sort of free association and the way he kind of breaks the rules, discursively to be all fancy about it. Mm-hmm. But it also reveals some things inadvertently. I think the way that he's not been doing it as much lately, although I think he's still popping up in the speeches, the way he'll be talking about one of these other policy areas, including the economy, and find some way to link it to immigration or to the border. It's almost like, Trump is looking at this, he looks at the same thing and he's not encumbered by anything, by the analytical part of this. He just kind of goes, oh, yeah, this is my issue. I need to pivot to this. And so, the housing crisis is the fault of immigrants. And, but it does speak to something you were raising, Josh, but that is, hiding in plain sight here. And that is just the touchstone of border security and immigration and all this. Even, and maybe particularly as maybe we're seeing a slight erosion in the advantage, like you're seeing nationally, over the economy, there's still that consensus point you're talking to. That is still a safe harbor, rhetorically and policy-wise, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Small little point just to draw people's attention to. Democrats, Harris dominates on climate change, but the highest percentage of people saying neither was on climate change. And I'll bet I haven't let me be honest, haven't looked at the crosstab by age.
I would guess, yeah.
But my guess is it's younger people who say neither of these sides is really doing what they need to.
Yeah, I suspect that's the case.
Yeah, but anyway, just a small data point.
No, that's a because we did a thing a few years about there being something a small, and this was a few years
growing.
ago, a small degree of sort of difference by age among Republicans on climate change.
Yeah,
so that would be
and I think
consistent.
actually that's grown. I mean, so everything I've looked at recently, when you look at sort of Republicans under 40 versus, I'm sure you've probably seen versus Republicans over 40 on climate change, it's just two different groups. I mean, and we've talked about this in the past. I mean, the idea that you can say climate change doesn't exist to anybody, I would say, till a large percentage of people under 40 it's a little bit difficult.
Let's do a lightning round,
Let's
guys.
do
What's in here either we haven't talked about or we didn't adequately address or that was in the poll that you thought was interesting that we didn't get to? There's a lot of different things in here that we've not touched on. Josh, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Why don't I start? You
look eager. I mean, when you're doing that with your hands.
Well,
I think.
I'm ready. Yeah, I'm doing the. I'm doing the.
I think that means.
I'm doing the little monkey clap here. I'm excied.
See, I was thinking seal, but that's a regional thing.
Well, it'll be chimpanzee. Anyway, we talked about this on the podcast a couple weeks ago about sort of efforts by state officials to essentially, police registration, by the counties. And one of the things we wanted to ask, just out of curiosity, now again, we talked about in the podcast, there's a very clear political reason to try to essentially limit, especially the urban counties, from going crazy registering people, having to do with trends in, support for Democratic candidates in those areas. Having said that, we asked people, do you support or oppose Texas counties taking measures to encourage voter registration among eligible but unregistered Texas adults? We said eligible. We say they're unregistered. We're not non-citizens. Just to be clear, we're very clear that these are eligible voters, right? Overall, 66% of Texans support counties trying to register people to vote. That includes 76% of Democrats and 61% of Republicans. Only 15% of Republicans opposed it. And this is just, I think, one of those instances where, this is not, it's an example of, nobody was necessarily clamoring for the state to clamp down on the counties from registering people. So just putting that out there, nice little side result.
This could be an elite-based difference.
Could be a little bit more strategic.
For another podcast.
Yeah,
how about
exactly.
you, Darren? What do you think? What else?
Yeah, I'm in the tank for the contacting numbers. This is a question that I always want on the poll, and everybody relents. But
we did,
but only after making fun of me, which is fine.
We did not make fun of you at all for that.
No.
So I can guarantee you. When you sent that feedback, I said, we should do that.
We said we understand why Daron would want this.
Right. So
we're waiting for this moment.
Yeah.
So the drum roll, please. As of right now, so this is a poll that was in the field in early October, and we got 43% of people saying they had been contacted, not seen an ad, not been contacted by a political campaign organization. 43%, so almost 50%. The breakdown is about 23% said they were contacted by the Democrats, 26% by the Democrats, 23% by the Republicans. So a very, very slight Democratic edge on contacting. 49% said they'd been contacted by both. And this is kind of a new question this time around, the mode of contact. For those of you out there who feel that you're being inundated with text messages from these political organizations, you're correct.
You're not alone.
3/4 of Texans, likely voters, said they have received a text message encouraging them to vote or to participate. About half said they got an email message. About a third said they've had a phone call, and about 1 out of every 8 said they've received an in-person visit. Now, of course, these numbers are probably exaggerated. They're self-reported.
And again, likely voters.
Yeah. But they're really striking. I mean, the notion that Texas is not a battleground, which I think is correct, doesn't necessarily preclude a lot of political activity.
Yeah, I mean, I think it underlines, the distinction we've been making between, not a battleground, but increasingly competitive, and the political world is aware of that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It's not like the Democrats aren't doing anything in Texas. Let's put it that way.
Right. What about you, Jim?
Well, there were other things outside. I kind of want to go back a little bit to one of the items in the Cruz Harris race, and that's because
Cruz Allred.
Or Cruz Allred, sorry, but
You're thinking about 2028.
I'm thinking about 2028. There you go.
There you go.
I was really interested. We asked this. And it's a standard thing we do, and often I don't see anything that seems very interesting in here. But when we asked the voters,
tell us more.
What was that?
That's a frank admission.
Yeah, but when we ask
You've
people,
seen it all. Yeah.
When we ask people about how they place the ideology of the candidates, because we're seeing like the other thing that and I'm obviously just kind of it's on my mind, this notion of where a little more of an effort to reach out to the middle, where that's been successful and where that's not. And the degree to which how much of this is mobilization and how much of this is persuasion. I thought these numbers were kind of interesting, and that among and I said Harris because I want to bring the Harris number into this. When we ask people to say, do you think the candidate is extremely liberal on a 7-point scale to extremely conservative, 45% of Republicans say that Colin Allred is extremely liberal. 56% of Democrats say Cruz is extremely conservative. But then you look at the presidential race, 80% of Republicans say Harris is extremely liberal. Only 50% of Republicans say Trump is extremely liberal. And I think
Extremely conservative.
Or extremely conservative. I think there are just multiple stories embedded in that in both races in terms of, Trump as the figurehead of the Republican Party. The effectiveness of, the campaign to define Harris, in the efforts in which one, but also, a little bit more drag on, a little less success in defining Allred with the discussion of, sex gender reassignment and all of this. So anyway, I'm still obviously kind of mulling around in that, but I think I'd have to go back and look again, but those numbers generally don't look quite like this. It's a really interesting representation of what the narratives are of the race.
Yeah, I think we last asked it in 2016, but I think we were prompted by sort of different rationales in some way, right? But it certainly is. It's turned out to be really, really interesting. I mean, to your point, something I was thinking about this morning, kind of in the preparation of this, thinking about these results in particular, and sort of Trump's kind of more amorphous ideological placement. And what's interesting is, one, him as the figurehead of the party, but two, potentially as the figurehead of the party in the White House without any sort of electoral constraint. Yeah. And what does that do for the party going ahead in terms of, messaging, message control, kind of what the party's about?
Yeah, if we'd have asked, do you think Trump is too extreme? I think we would have got off-the-chart numbers with Democrats.
Yeah.
But whatever the rap is on Trump, it's not that he's some sort of consistent ideologue.
Yeah,
right.
It's just not. And you look at it, and it's the people are right. He's got tariffs. He's sort of said, I'm not going to pursue a national ban on abortion. I don't know what you're talking. He's disavowed the 2025 project, which is a much more kind of plainly orthodox conservative document.
Well, and just I was thinking about this when you were talking a few minutes ago about Trump not being somebody you would expect to really be the Texas Republican, a little libertine, a little, I mean, this is not like a buttoned up, conservative Republican.
But, just to sort of bring a couple points back together here and maybe we can finish it out is, we have asked questions about the extremism of Trump's policies in the context of immigration and border security. And that's where it is interesting, where even at points in time in which, the administration during the first term went, is, I think beyond the bounds that we were used to in terms of rhetoric, but also policy around immigration. When we asked Texas voters, and especially Texas Republicans, has he gone far enough or could he go further? Or has he gone too far? Almost none said he'd gone too far. And the balance was he'd gone far enough, or actually he could go further. And I think the plurality said he could go further. And so on the touchstone issue here for Republican voters in the states, even though he might not be the best Republican, I think this is why, to say, I do think there is some logic to Cruz outperforming him a little bit in a state with such a conservative ideological bedrock and someone who is so associated with conservatism in Cruz, maybe outperforming Trump with some of those voters. But on this one issue that they all say, this is the issue we care about, this is the issue that we vote on, this is the issue that's the most important in the state, Trump could be even more extreme, and he's actually one of the most extreme candidates in this one space. So I think, yes
I think
and no,
that makes
right?
sense.
That's an interesting idea. I was actually thinking about, as you were saying, about Harris on the other side, on abortion, which is, look, these are marker issues in some ways, in which your willingness to agree to extreme policies is less a reflection of your sincere preferences for policy and more an indication of how serious you think the
Litmus
problem
tests,
is.
right? We talk about this a lot, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So, and I do see that. I see that on immigration, border security, and I think I see it on abortion too, which is we're not having a conversation about, where should the limits be drawn. That's and Harris, so far as I can tell, has played almost no price for, whatever, Tim Walz in particular, with pretty extreme positions on the issues, so far as we can tell.
Well, I'm glad that you guys liked my point.
Good point.
Wow.
Nice job. Good job out of you.
Good job, Jim. Well, thank you guys, as always, for being here. More fun than people ought to be allowed to have at work, frankly.
It's our safe space.
Thanks to all of you for listening, and particularly thanks to our crew here in the audio studio in the Liberal Arts Development Lab here at the University of Texas. As always, remember there are, all the data we talked about, lots more drill down, lots of graphics and analysis you can use at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. Many different routes if you just go to that URL to all of this data and various ways of entering into it. So thanks again for listening, and we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.